December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Dawn has not yet broken, but the darkness is split open by something far more violent than daylight. A German soldier, barely 19 years old, crouches in a frozen foxhole along the Siegfried Line. His breath comes in shallow clouds. For 3 days, his unit has been advancing through the American lines, pushing forward in what will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. They have momentum. They have surprise. They have the will of desperate men fighting for a Reich that is crumbling around them. But now, in this moment before the sun rises, something changes. He hears it first, a sound like tearing fabric, multiplied 100 times over. Then the world explodes, not in waves, not in sequence, but all at once. The ground beneath him convulses. Trees disintegrate into splinters. The air itself seems to fragment. In the span of 3 seconds, more than 20 shells detonate across a 100-meter radius. He presses his face into the frozen earth and waits for death. When the barrage lifts and he dares to look up, half his squad is gone. Not retreating. Gone. What he has just experienced is not the random fury of war. It is precision. It is calculation. It is the American one, 05mm howitzer, and it has just rewritten the rules of artillery warfare. The story of how one weapon system came to dominate the Western Front begins not in the forests of Europe, but in the bureaucratic offices and proving grounds of the United States between the wars. When the First World War ended in 1918, the American military found itself in possession of an artillery arsenal that was, in large part, French. The famous French 75 had served American gunners well, but military planners understood that future conflicts would demand something different, something more mobile, something that could deliver both the rapid fire of field artillery and the destructive power of heavier guns. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, as Europe slid toward another catastrophe, American ordnance engineers worked in relative obscurity to develop a new class of weapon. What emerged from this process was the M2A1 howitzer, chambered for 105mm shells, mounted on a carriage that could be towed by truck or tracked vehicle, and capable of being brought into action in minutes rather than hours. The genius of the 105 lay not in any single revolutionary feature, but in the careful balance of competing requirements. It weighed just over 2,000 kilograms, light enough to be highly mobile across the varied terrain of modern warfare. Its maximum range extended to 11,000 meters, far enough to reach deep into enemy positions without exposing the gun crew to direct fire. The howitzer could fire at a rate of 4 rounds per minute in sustained bombardment, or reach burst rates of 8 rounds per minute when the tactical situation demanded maximum violence in minimum time. Each high-explosive shell weighed 15 kilograms and carried nearly 2 kilograms of TNT, enough to create a lethal fragmentation radius of 35 meters. But these numbers, stark as they are, fail to capture what made the weapon truly formidable. What made it formidable was the system built around it. When American divisions began deploying to Europe in 1942, each infantry division included 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers, 36 guns in total, organized into batteries of 6. This was not accidental. American artillery doctrine, refined through years of study and influenced by observations of the early war in Europe, emphasized massed fires delivered with unprecedented coordination. The division artillery headquarters became a nerve center capable of directing all 36 guns, plus attached units, against a single target in a matter of minutes. Forward observers, equipped with radio sets and trained to calculate firing solutions rapidly, accompanied the infantry. They could see what the gunners could not, and they could call down thunder from miles away. This integration of observation, communication, and fire control transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a decisive weapon of maneuver warfare. The technical specifications of the M2A1 enabled something that German artillery, for all its own considerable capabilities, struggled to match: the time-on-target barrage. This technique required multiple artillery batteries, often separated by kilometers, to fire at slightly different moments so that their shells would arrive on target simultaneously. The mathematics were complex. Each gun crew had to account for their position, the target coordinates, atmospheric conditions, propellant temperature, and the precise flight time of their particular rounds. The Fire Direction Center would calculate each battery's firing time to the second, then transmit the orders. When executed properly, the result was devastating. An observer might call for fire on an enemy position, and 15 seconds later, 30 shells would detonate across that position within a 2-second window. There was no warning, no gradual build-up allowing troops to take cover, just sudden, overwhelming destruction. German soldiers, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, had experienced artillery fire before the Eastern Front. In particular, had exposed them to the massed fires of Soviet artillery, which often exceeded American concentrations in sheer volume. But what they encountered from American guns was different in character. Soviet artillery, devastating as it could be, often followed predictable patterns: long preparatory bombardments that telegraphed an impending assault, or reactive fires that took time to organize. American artillery responded with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural. A German squad, attempting to cross an open field, might come under fire within 60 seconds of being spotted by a forward observer. A company, forming up for an attack, could find itself engulfed in steel before the first platoon moved forward. This responsiveness, this ability to bring massive firepower to bear in the time it took to call in coordinates and fire a mission, created a persistent psychological pressure that wore down even veteran troops. In the spring of 1943, American artillery crews received their baptism of fire in North Africa. The battles across Tunisia tested doctrine, equipment, and men against an enemy that had been fighting for 3 years. The German Afrika Korps, though depleted and cut off from adequate supply, remained a dangerous opponent with skilled gunners and proven tactics. In the hills around Kasserine Pass, and later at El Guetar, American 105 batteries learned hard lessons about positioning, camouflage, and counter-battery fire. But they also demonstrated something that began to concern German commanders: the sheer volume of shells American logistics could deliver to the guns. A German artillery battalion might receive 50 rounds per gun per day. An American battalion could fire 500. This disparity, born of America's industrial capacity and its secure supply lines across the Atlantic, meant that American gunners could afford to be generous with their ammunition. They could fire speculative missions to suppress suspected positions. They could lay down harassing fire throughout the night to prevent enemy movement. They could, when the situation demanded it, unleash barrages that consumed ammunition at rates that would have been unthinkable for their adversaries. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 brought new challenges and new innovations. The terrain, mountainous with poor roads and limited maneuver space, seemed designed to favor defenders. Yet American artillery adapted. The 105's combination of range and mobility allowed batteries to leapfrog forward, maintaining continuous fire support as infantry units advanced through the hills. During the grinding campaign up the Italian peninsula that followed, artillery became the answer to problems that infantry alone could not solve. German paratroopers held fortified positions in the mountains south of Rome, positions that seemed impregnable to direct assault. American commanders responded by bringing forward every available gun and systematically reducing those positions with days of concentrated bombardment. The 105 batteries, positioned in the valleys, could elevate their tubes to drop shells onto reverse slopes where German troops had taken shelter. Forward observers, often moving with the lead infantry companies, adjusted fire in real time, walking barrages up mountainsides and collapsing defensive positions one after another. By the time American forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the artillery system had been refined to a high degree of lethality. The hedgerows of Normandy, those ancient earthen walls, topped with dense vegetation that divided every field into a separate fortress, created a defender's paradise. German troops could move through the bocage unseen, could set up machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire, could turn every lane into a killing ground. American infantry, advancing through this maze, found their technological advantages in armor and air support, partly negated by terrain. But artillery could reach anywhere. A Sherman tank might be stopped by a hedgerow it could not penetrate. A P-47 Thunderbolt might be unable to see a target beneath the canopy, but a 105 shell, arcing through the sky at a steep angle, would crash through leaves and branches to detonate in the confined space of a Norman field, sending fragments ricocheting off the earthen walls in every direction. The Battle for Saint-Lô in July 1944 demonstrated the full maturity of American artillery doctrine. The city, a vital road junction, had become the anchor of German defensive lines south of the invasion beaches. For 17 days, American forces ground forward through terrain that gave every advantage to the defender. The 105 batteries fired continuously, day and night, consuming shells at rates that strained even American logistics fire missions, came in a constant stream. Infantry calling for support against a strong point, observers directing fires onto suspected artillery positions, planned barrages to soften up objectives before assault. The guns grew so hot that crews had to pour water on the barrels between fire missions. Shell casings piled up around the gun pits in Brass Mountains. And still, the shells kept coming, trucks arriving from the beaches every few hours to replenish the ammunition stocks. When Saint-Lô finally fell, German prisoners spoke of the bombardment in tones that mixed respect with something close to awe. They had expected American firepower. They had not expected it to be so relentless, so responsive, so apparently unlimited. The breakout from Normandy in late July, Operation Cobra, began with an aerial bombardment that was meant to obliterate German defenses along a narrow front, but it was artillery that exploited the breach. As American armor poured through the gap, 105 battalions raced forward with them, sometimes unlimbering their guns within sight of retreating German columns. The pursuit across France that followed became a different kind of artillery war. Instead of static positions and planned barrages, gun crews learned to shoot and move, supporting the rapid advance with harassing fires that prevented German forces from establishing new defensive lines. A typical fire mission during this period might last 15 minutes, drive into position, unlimber the gun, receive coordinates, fire 10 rounds, limber up, and move before German counter-battery fire could find the position. This pace of operations was exhausting, but it kept German forces off balance and contributed to the speed of the Allied advance. By autumn 1944, as Allied forces approached the German border, the character of the fighting changed again. The pursuit was over. The Wehrmacht, fighting now for the survival of their homeland, stiffened their resistance. The Siegfried Line, that belt of fortifications along Germany's western border, presented obstacles that could not simply be bypassed. Bunkers with walls of reinforced concrete, dragon's teeth anti-tank barriers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire, all designed to break up attacks and channel them into killing zones. American artillery adapted once more. The 105, firing a high explosive shell, could not penetrate the heavy fortifications, but it could suppress the defenders while engineers worked to breach the obstacles. It could fire smoke shells to blind German observation posts. It could lay down continuous harassing fire on supply routes and assembly areas behind the fortifications. And when infantry finally assaulted a bunker, artillery could deliver a protective barrage around the objective, isolating it from reinforcement. The German offensive in the Ardennes that began on December 16, 1944, caught American forces by surprise. 3 German armies, husbanding their strength in secret, crashed into a lightly defended sector of the front with the goal of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. In the first days of the offensive, German units made significant gains, overrunning American positions and creating the bulge in the Allied lines that gave the battle its name. But even in retreat, American artillery remained a potent force. 105 batteries that found themselves in danger of being overrun fired their guns at point-blank range, sometimes over open sights at approaching German tanks, before withdrawing. Other batteries, though surrounded, continued to fire missions in support of isolated American units. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and attached units held out against German encirclement, artillery became essential to the defense. The gun crews, firing at maximum rates and constantly shifting positions to avoid counter-battery fire, broke up repeated German attacks and helped keep the vital road junction in American hands. As the weather cleared and Allied reinforcements arrived, American artillery played a central role in stopping the German advance and then crushing the salient. The sheer weight of fire available to American commanders was decisive. At the Elsenborn Ridge, where the northern shoulder of the Bulge was held by American infantry, supported by massive artillery concentrations, German attacks were simply smothered under bombardment. Entire battalions, attempting to advance across open ground or through forested areas, were caught by time-on-target barrages that left the ground carpeted with dead German after-action reports from this period. When they mention artillery at all, describe the American fires in terms that suggest not just tactical defeat, but psychological trauma units reported being unable to maneuver, unable to attack, unable even to hold positions under the sustained bombardment. The phrase that appears repeatedly in these reports, translated from the German, is variations of overwhelming fire or destructive fire of extraordinary intensity. It is in this context, in the frozen forests and shattered towns of the Ardennes, that the legend of the Rainmaker takes its deepest root. There is no verified German document that uses this specific term, no captured orders, no radio intercepts, no prisoner interrogation reports that record German soldiers calling the American 105 der Regenmacher or any similar nickname. What does exist is a pattern of descriptions in post-war memoirs and in contemporary accounts of the psychological impact of American artillery. German soldiers described the sudden nature of the bombardments. One moment silence, the next moment chaos. They described the density of the shell bursts, falling so close together that individual explosions merged into a continuous roar. They described the feeling of helplessness, of being unable to predict when or where the next barrage would fall, of watching the sky and waiting for the sound that meant death was falling toward them. These descriptions, repeated across multiple accounts and multiple battles, capture something essential about the experience of being on the receiving end of American artillery. The metaphor of rain is apt in ways that go beyond simple poetry. Rain does not announce itself minutes in advance. It does not fall in neat lines that can be avoided. It comes suddenly, it falls everywhere, and there is nowhere to hide from it except to go underground or wait for it to stop. This is precisely how American artillery operated at its most effective. A German patrol moving through a forest might attract the attention of a forward observer they never saw. Within 2 minutes, shells would begin falling on their position. Not a few shells allowing time to scatter and take cover, but a dozen shells arriving within seconds of each other, bracketing the entire area, turning trees into shrapnel and frozen ground into a moonscape. If the patrol was lucky and the barrage short, survivors might emerge from whatever cover they had found and attempt to continue their mission. More often, they would report back that the mission was impossible, that American artillery made movement in that sector suicidal. After enough such reports, entire areas of the front became dead zones where German units would not go except under cover of darkness or fog, and sometimes not even then. American artillerymen themselves, the men who served the guns, developed their own relationship with their weapon that mixed pride, exhaustion, and a kind of grim professionalism. A gun crew consisted of 7 men, the chief of section who commanded the gun, the gunner who aimed it, the assistant gunner who set the charges, and 4 cannoneers who loaded, fired, and maintained the weapon. These men worked with mechanical precision, each movement practiced until it became automatic. When a fire mission came through, there was no wasted motion. The chief of section received the coordinates and the number of rounds. The gunner traversed and elevated the tube to the proper angle. The assistant gunner prepared the shells with the correct powder charges. The cannoneers loaded and fired in a rhythm that could send 4 15-kilogram shells downrange in a minute. Between missions, they cleaned the gun, replenished ammunition, ate when they could, and slept in shifts. The work was physically demanding and mentally numbing in its repetition, but every man understood that somewhere forward, American infantrymen were counting on them. The forward observers, those lieutenants and sergeants who accompanied the infantry and called in the fire missions, were the vital link between the guns and the battlefield. They moved with the leading elements, often ahead of the main body of troops, searching for good observation positions and watching for targets. A skilled observer could read terrain, could predict where the enemy might establish positions, and could bring fire to bear before German troops had time to dig in. The job was extraordinarily dangerous. Observers had to expose themselves to see the battlefield, which meant exposing themselves to enemy fire. They carried radios, which made them priority targets when German forces learned to recognize the distinctive equipment. Casualties among forward observers ran high, but the position was never short of volunteers. There was a particular satisfaction, those who survived the war later recalled, in watching a problematic enemy position that had been holding up the advance simply vanish under a properly adjusted barrage. It was the satisfaction of having power, real and immediate power, to shape the battle. The logistics required to keep American artillery firing at the rates it did were themselves a kind of miracle of modern warfare. Each 105 shell, complete with its fuse and propellant, weighed about 20 kilograms. A single battery of 6 guns, firing a modest 100 rounds per gun per day, required 12,000 kilograms of ammunition. Multiply that by the hundreds of batteries deployed across the European theater, and the numbers become staggering. Millions of shells had to be manufactured in American factories, loaded onto ships, transported across the Atlantic through waters patrolled by U-boats, unloaded at European ports, moved to forward ammunition dumps by truck, and finally delivered to the gun positions themselves. The supply chain stretched 6,000 kilometers from factory to foxhole, and it had to function continuously, in all weather, under enemy fire, without interruption. That it did function, that American guns never fell silent for lack of shells, represents an achievement of industrial organization that was as important to Allied victory as any battlefield success. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, and Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, the 105 batteries advanced with them. The landscape of war changed from fortified positions to urban combat, from static lines to fluid pursuit, from defense to disintegration, but the artillery remained essential. In the rubbled cities along the Rhine, 105 batteries fired in direct support of infantry, fighting house to house, reducing strongpoints and covering advances across open squares. In the rolling countryside beyond, they engaged targets of opportunity, supply columns, retreating units, hastily established defensive positions. The pace of operations accelerated, fire missions coming so rapidly that gun crews lost track of how many rounds they had fired. Some batteries expended more ammunition in the final weeks of the war than in the previous 6 months combined. German forces, by this late stage of the war, had lost most of their ability to coordinate effective responses to American artillery. Their own artillery, never as numerous or as well supplied, had been steadily attrited through months of combat counter-battery fire, which earlier in the war had posed a real threat to American gun positions, became rare. German forward observers, when they existed at all, could no longer communicate effectively with their guns. Radio networks had broken down. Telephone lines were cut, units were scattered and command structures fractured. The Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe in 1940 was being ground into dust by a combination of forces, and American artillery was among the foremost of those forces. When German soldiers surrendered in the final weeks of the war, they often spoke of the bombardments as the worst aspect of their experience. Worse than the cold, worse than the hunger, worse than the fear of Soviet revenge. The constant presence of American artillery, the knowledge that at any moment shells might fall from an empty sky, had broken something essential in their will to fight. The final accounting of the 105's contribution to Allied victory is difficult to calculate with precision. Artillery kills are not easily attributed. When an infantryman shoots an enemy soldier, there is a direct, observable result. When artillery fires on a position, and that position later falls silent, was it the shells that caused the casualties, or did the enemy simply withdraw? Did they die, or did they scatter? The statistics that do exist suggest an enormous impact. American artillery is estimated to have caused between 50 and 70% of all German casualties on the Western Front. The 105, as the most numerous artillery piece in American service and the primary weapon of divisional artillery, was responsible for a substantial portion of that total. But beyond the simple body count, the weapon's impact was strategic. It allowed American forces to attack with confidence, knowing that overwhelming fire support was available on call. It forced German units to remain dispersed, to move at night, to avoid concentrations that might attract artillery fire. It degraded the effectiveness of German infantry, artillery, and armor by preventing them from massing for effective counterattacks. It was, in short, a weapon that multiplied the effectiveness of every other American military asset. The nickname Rainmaker, whether it was truly used by German soldiers in the field, or whether it emerged later as a way to capture the weapon's impact, serves as a useful shorthand for a deeper truth about artillery warfare in World War II. The truth is that modern, industrialized warfare had made the battlefield a place of impersonal, massive violence, where death could arrive without warning from beyond the horizon, A soldier could fight with courage, could follow every tactical doctrine, could do everything right, and still be killed by a shell fired by a man he never saw from a gun emplaced miles away. This was not new to World War II. Artillery had dominated casualties in World War I as well, but the American artillery system perfected it. The speed of response, the accuracy of fire, the weight of bombardment, all combined to create a killing ground where traditional concepts of courage and tactics became less relevant than simple mathematics. How many shells fell in a given area? How quickly could fire be shifted from one target to another? How long could a unit sustain that rate of fire? These were the questions that determined outcomes, more so than individual heroism or tactical brilliance. For the men who survived the war and returned home, the artillerymen who had served the 105s carried with them mixed feelings about their service. Pride, certainly, in having been part of a weapons system that proved decisive. Satisfaction in the technical mastery they had achieved, the ability to deliver shells on target with remarkable precision, but also a kind of distance from the effects of their work. They had fired at map coordinates, at numbers on a plotting board. They had not seen, in most cases, the results of their fire. They did not have to look into the faces of the men they killed. This distance allowed them to do their jobs with efficiency and without being paralyzed by moral doubt, but it also meant that their experience of the war was fundamentally different from that of the infantry they supported. The infantrymen saw war at its most intimate and terrible. The artillerymen experienced it as a problem in applied mathematics and mechanical timing. Both perspectives were necessary for victory, and neither could have succeeded without the other. The technology of the 105 howitzer, revolutionary as it seemed during the war, was quickly superseded by new developments. In the decades after 1945, artillery pieces became more powerful, with longer ranges and more sophisticated fire control systems, rocket artillery, guided munitions, and eventually precision-guided shells made the massed barrages of World War II seem crude by comparison. The M2A1 howitzer itself remained in service for several more decades, seeing action in Korea and Vietnam, but it was gradually replaced by more modern designs. Yet the fundamental principles established by American artillery doctrine in World War II, massed fires, rapid response, integration with maneuver forces, overwhelming logistics, remain central to artillery employment today. The lesson of the 105 was not about the specific characteristics of that particular weapon, but about the system in which it operated. A good gun, well supplied, expertly handled, and integrated into a responsive command structure, could achieve effects far beyond what its technical specifications might suggest. In the small towns and villages of France, Belgium, and Germany, where the fighting was heaviest, monuments now stand to commemorate the battles and honor the dead. In those places, elderly residents who were children during the war sometimes still remember the sound of the American artillery. They remember the particular whistle of incoming shells, different from German artillery or British guns. They remember the ground shaking, the windows rattling, the plaster falling from ceilings. They remember their parents herding them into cellars, and the wait in darkness for the bombardment to end. And they remember, after the shells stopped falling and the American troops advanced through their towns, the young men with dirty faces and tired eyes who had called down that thunder, who had used it to break the German army, and in doing so, had destroyed much of the landscape, but ultimately brought liberation. The memory is complex, tinged with loss and trauma, but also with recognition that the artillery, terrible as it was, had been necessary. The 105 howitzer sits now in museums and on memorials, a relic of a particular moment in military history. Visitors can walk around it, can read the plaques that explain its specifications and its service record. But the thing itself, the cold metal and complex mechanisms, cannot convey what it meant to the men who used it or faced it. It cannot convey the sudden terror of a time-on-target barrage, shells arriving from multiple directions in the same instant, the coordinated mathematics of death made manifest. It cannot convey the grinding exhaustion of gun crews, firing hundreds of rounds per day for weeks on end, or the satisfaction of a forward observer calling for fire and watching the enemy position dissolve under high explosive. It cannot convey the industrial scale of the ammunition expenditure, the millions of shells produced and transported and fired in service of military necessity. These experiences, these human dimensions of the weapon's employment, exist now only in written accounts and fading memories. What we can say, looking back across the decades, is that the American 105mm howitzer represents a particular approach to warfare that characterized the American military effort in World War II. It was not the most advanced weapon, not the most powerful, not the most elegant, but it was effective, it was reliable, it could be produced in enormous quantities, and it could be integrated into a system that maximized its impact. The American way of war in that conflict was fundamentally industrial. Throw resources, money, manufacturing capacity, and human effort at the problem until it is solved. The 105 was the perfect embodiment of that approach. Each gun was good. 36 guns were better. Hundreds of guns, all coordinated, all supplied with unlimited ammunition, all responsive to forward observers who could call fire within minutes. That was decisive. The legend of the Rainmaker, true or not in its specifics, captures an essential truth about the weapon and the men who wielded it. When those shells began to fall, when the sky opened up and steel rained down without warning or mercy, the men on the receiving end had no good options. They could not run fast enough. They could not dig deep enough. They could only endure and hope to survive. And when the barrage lifted and they emerged from whatever cover they had found, they knew it could begin again at any moment. That psychological weight, that constant threat of sudden, overwhelming violence, was as important as the physical destruction the shells caused. It degraded performance, eroded morale, and ultimately convinced many German soldiers that further resistance was futile. In the end, artillery does not win wars by itself. It cannot hold ground, cannot accept surrender, cannot govern conquered territory. That requires infantry, armor, and all the other arms of military force. But artillery can make everything else possible. It can suppress enemy fire, can destroy fortifications, can break up attacks, can cover advances, can cut supply lines, and can create the conditions for victory. The American 105mm howitzer did all these things across the battlefields of Western Europe from Normandy to the Elbe. It gave American commanders a tool they could rely on absolutely, a weapon that would fire when called upon, that would hit what it aimed at, and that would never be silenced by lack of shells. In a war where industrial capacity and technological sophistication increasingly determined outcomes, the 105 was perhaps the single most important artillery piece on the Allied side. The Germans had good guns of their own, the Soviets had more guns, but no one had a better system for delivering rapid, massed, accurate artillery fire than the Americans with their 105 battalions. That system, that combination of weapon, doctrine, training, and logistics, helped bring down the Third Reich and restored peace to a continent that had been consumed by war. The sun sets now over the fields of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, over the countless places where men fought and died more than 80 years ago. The scars have healed in the landscape, though occasionally a farmer still turns up rusted metal or unexploded ordnance in his field. The generation that fought that war has almost entirely passed, their direct memories fading into history. But the story of what they accomplished and the tools they used to accomplish it remains worth telling. The 105 howitzer was one of those tools, not glamorous, not celebrated in the way that fighters' planes and tanks are celebrated, but essential. And for the men who faced it, whether they called it the Rainmaker or simply cursed it in their own language, it was a force of nature, implacable and terrible. A reminder that in modern war, death can fall from a clear sky without warning, delivered by mathematics and machinery, as unstoppable as rain.